Welcome back, everyone. Last time we took that deep dive, into Kant's Transcendental Aesthetic. It was all about how our minds experience the world, like through these lenses of space and time. It's really fascinating stuff. Like our brains come preloaded, with these structures, these fundamental structures that shape how we perceive absolutely everything.
It is fascinating, isn't it? It really is. Kant was really grappling with, with how we know anything at all.
Yeah.
Not just the stuff we know, the facts and figures, but like the very processes themselves, the ones that make knowing even, possible in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. And so this time we're kind of tackling part two of Kant's critique of pure reason, the
Mhm.
Transcendental Logic. And for this one, we've got, well, of course, we've got Kant's text, but we've also got, we've pulled in some contemporary analysis, some other perspectives on this. And of course, we have your expertise to guide us along. So this is going to be really interesting. So in this deep dive, we're going to be figuring out how the mind uses like pure thought to make sense of the world around us. Are you ready to do this? Are you ready to unpack this?
Always. Unpack? Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it because, Kant is dense. He's not the easiest read, but there are some real aha moments. Once you start to see how the pieces fit together, how the puzzle comes together, it's pretty amazing.
For sure. For sure. Okay, so before we jump into like the complexities of transcendental logic, let's go back to the basics a little bit, just for ourselves and for our listener too, just to kind of remind everyone about this foundation that Kant has already laid out for us. So he believes that all of our knowledge, all the stuff we know, comes from like two primary sources. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He calls them sensibility, that's one, and then understanding. Sensibility is like, think of it like all the raw data, all the stuff that we're getting from our senses, sights, sounds, textures, all of that. It's just flooding
It's
in
kind of
it.
like our brain's inbox, you know, just flooded with like a million emails every single day.
Perfect, perfect. A perfect analogy, yeah, nonstop sensory input. That's exactly what it is. But then, and this is where things get really cool, we have understanding. So understanding is how our minds, they take that flood of information, that flood of data that's coming in, and they actually do something with it. They process it, they make sense of it. It's like the software in your inbox, that organizes everything, sorts the junk from the real stuff, tries to make sense of it all.
Okay, I'm with you. I see the distinction there. But honestly, yeah, if I'm being honest, I'm already a little lost because like, how can we understand anything at all before we even have, any experience to base it on? That seems crazy.
That's the question. That's the million-dollar question. It really is. And it leads us right into this idea, this thing that Kant calls transcendental logic. And it's not your everyday logic, like
Mm.
if A then B kind of logic. This is something different. This is about pure thought processes. This is about the stuff that's happening before you even have a specific experience of something.
So before we even open our eyes in the morning, our minds, they're already set up, like with certain ways of thinking, certain ways of understanding.
Exactly. Exactly. And those ways of thinking, they're kind of pre-wired almost. Those are what Kant is trying to like uncover. He wants to understand those fundamental concepts that make, any knowledge at all possible.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere. But I have a feeling Kant being Kant, he doesn't just stop there. Yeah.
He does not. He makes it a little more intricate. Yeah.
Yeah.
A little more interesting maybe to some people. He breaks down this transcendental logic into two parts. He calls them analytic and dialectic. But don't worry, it's helpful because it actually lets him explore all these different ways that our minds can actually use this pure thought. Sometimes they use it correctly, and sometimes, well, not so much.
Ooh, okay. So are we talking like logic problems? Are we talking brain teasers here? Where's the transcendental part come in?
It's even bigger than that. It's way more profound. Think of it this way. Think of the analytic like a quality control inspector, but for your thoughts. Okay. So the analytic, it's about examining, really looking at those pure concepts of understanding and then making sure that they're working the way they're supposed to, that they're, consistent, that they're logical, that they're not contradicting themselves.
So making sure our mental software isn't glitching out, basically. We need our understanding to be functioning properly, to be working the right way.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. But then there's dialectic, and dialectic is where Kant gets into this tricky territory because dialectic is about how reason, our ability to think and reason, it can sometimes lead us astray. It's like when we try to take pure thought and apply it to things beyond our experience, stuff we can't possibly know through our senses, that's where we can get into trouble. We can end up with illusions, misconceptions, things that aren't really true.
So it's like our minds. They can build these, these elaborate castles of thought, but sometimes those castles are built on foundations of sand. That's kind of unsettling, isn't it?
It is unsettling. It really is. But this is why Kant is so important. This is why we're still talking about him today, because he's showing us, look, reason has its limits. It can only take us so far. And if we want to avoid getting, caught in these philosophical dead ends, we have to be aware of those limits. We have to know where reason starts and something else begins.
Whoa. This is a lot to process, honestly. I'm starting to see why Kant is considered such a challenging philosopher, but also such a brilliant one, obviously.
He absolutely is. He was a genius.
Yeah.
But before we get too overwhelmed here, because it's easy to do with Kant, let me just emphasize something really important that he brings up. He's a big proponent of pure thought, and these categories we're talking about. But he also knew, he was very clear about this, that it's all pointless. Like, it doesn't even matter without the raw material of experience. Without that, it's just an empty shell.
Wait, so even though we're talking about these pre-programmed ways of thinking, these categories, we still need our senses. We still need our experience of the world to give us something to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah, we do. We can't just sit in a dark room and think our way to knowledge. We need to interact with the world. We need to see it, hear it, touch it, taste it. And Kant uses this term, he calls them intuitions. He's describing the direct perceptions that we get from our senses, the raw data. Think of them like building blocks. You can have the most amazing blueprint, for a house, but you can't build anything without bricks and mortar.
Okay, I see it. That's a great way to put it. So even though we're focusing on how our minds, structure reality in this deep dive, we're not saying that, actually experiencing the world isn't important. We still need that, right?
Not at all. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the next part of, Kant's Transcendental Logic, it gets even deeper. He really gets into what he calls the categories of understanding. And these are like the tools, the mental tools that we use to organize all those, the sensory building blocks, all that raw data coming in. And it's those categories are how we turn it into something that actually makes sense to us, that we can understand.
Okay, now you've really got me hooked. Categories of understanding. It sounds like we're about to get into like the nuts and bolts, like we're really going to look under the hood and see how our minds actually construct, our reality. But this is getting good.
It is. And trust me, it's going to get even more fascinating. We're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more to explore.
Well, I'm ready to dive in. Listeners, if you're still with us, stay tuned. We're going to be unpacking these categories, and we're going to be trying to make sense of Kant's, brilliant and sometimes totally mind-bending philosophy.
It's going to be a wild ride. Buckle up. So, picking up where we left off, I think our listener might be wondering how all this pure thought stuff, like how does it actually connect to, something as simple as truth? What even is truth,
Yeah, I was just thinking that. It's like we've all had those arguments, where somebody says, well, that's your truth, but this is mine. And it's like, ugh, come on,
Yeah.
So is Kant even saying that objective truth is a thing?
Yeah.
Like, is there such a thing? Or is it all, like, relative?
That's a really good question. And honestly, it gets right to the heart of this distinction that Kant makes between what he calls just plain general logic and then transcendental logic, the stuff we're talking about.
Okay, yeah, remind me, what's the difference again? I'm still trying to wrap my head around it.
Sure. So think of general logic like a recipe. Okay. The recipe lays out like the steps, right? The procedures, the rules of the game, basically, for creating a dish. Or, in this case, for making a logical argument. And a judgment, a statement about something, it's considered true in general logic, traditional logic, if it accurately reflects, the object that it's describing, the thing it's talking about. And it follows the rules, of course. So pretty straightforward.
So, like, the sky is blue. Would that be true? Because it, like, corresponds to what we see, right? When we look up, the sky is usually blue.
Yeah.
And it follows the rules of, like, grammar and logic, right?
Exactly.
The proper syntax.
Exactly. But this is where Kant throws a little bit of a wrench in things. Because he's saying that general logic, it can only evaluate the form of an argument. It can't really tell you anything about the content, about what the argument is actually saying. It can tell you if you followed the steps correctly, in the recipe. But it can't tell you if the ingredients were any good or if the chef even knew what they were doing. You know what I mean?
So someone could make a perfectly logical argument, following all the rules, all the steps in the recipe, but it could still be based on, like, totally bogus information.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's where this transcendental logic comes in. Because what Kant wants to do is dig deeper. He doesn't want to just look at the form of truth, you know? He wants to get into how our minds, how our thinking actually contributes to shaping what we even perceive as true, what we believe is true. Because our minds are doing a lot of work behind the scenes, you know?
Okay, so it's kind of like transcendental logic is the quality control inspector. But for our minds, right, it's making sure that our like mental factories aren't churning out a bunch of faulty products, a bunch of things that aren't really true.
That's a great way to put it. It really is. It's about those conditions of knowledge, the a priori conditions, the stuff that's built in, you know,
Mm.
to our minds. And those fundamental structures, they determine how we experience and understand everything, the whole world.
So how do these a priori conditions, how do they actually influence like how we understand what truth is? How do they work?
Well, remember those two parts of transcendental logic that we were talking about earlier, the analytic and the dialectic?
Yeah, yeah. The quality control inspector and the philosophical detective. I like those.
Right, exactly. So Kant, he applies those same ideas, those same concepts to truth itself. And he argues that the analytic, when you're looking at truth, it helps us to keep our thinking clear, consistent, you know? It's like making sure that our mental software is free of bugs, you know? Free of glitches, and making sure that our judgments, our statements about the world, they're actually aligning with, you know, our experiences and that they're not, you know, contradicting each other.
So analytic is kind of like saying, hold on a second. If you're saying that A is true, well, then B can also be true if it contradicts A. You know, let's get our facts straight. Let's be consistent here.
Yes, exactly, exactly. But then we've got dialectic, and this is where things get a little bit more tricky because dialectic, when it's applied to truth, it wants to explore these big, huge questions. You
Yeah.
know, the ultimate realities, the stuff that's beyond the reach of our senses. But, and this is a big but, this can be dangerous because it can lead us into like speculation,
Mhm.
illusion, you know, making stuff up, basically, because
Yeah.
we're trying to go beyond what we can actually know.
So dialectic is like the part of us that wants to know what happens after we die or what's the meaning of life, even though those questions might be like impossible to answer. Like they might be beyond what we can know.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And Kant, being the, you know, the genius that he was, he recognized that both of these aspects of reason, the analytic and the dialectic, they're both important. We need the analytic to keep us grounded, to keep our thinking, you know, consistent, clear.
Hmm.
But we also need the dialectic because it pushes us, you know,
Yeah.
it pushes the boundaries of what we think is even possible. It makes us ask the big questions. And that's important too.
This is starting to make sense, but I'm also kind of feeling like we're getting into some pretty deep water here.
Hmm.
Philosophically speaking, I'm starting to understand why Kant is so hard to like wrap your head around.
He definitely is, yeah. He's a tough one. But trust me, the rewards are worth it. They really are. Because by looking at, you know, by dissecting how our minds work, Kant gives us this profound new way of understanding not just ourselves, but like the very nature of reality itself. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. And I think our listener would agree. It's pretty empowering, actually, to start to see how this all works.
Okay, you've convinced me. I'm ready to go further. Let's keep diving deeper. What's next on this Kantian adventure of ours?
Okay, so we've kind of established, right, that like our minds, they're not just passively absorbing information like, you know, sponges just soaking it all up. They're actively structuring, they're organizing our experience of the world, and they're doing it through these categories of understanding that, you know, that Kant talks about. And it's like our brains, they come, you know, preloaded with this set of tools, these organizational tools, and we use them to make sense of literally everything we encounter.
Exactly, yeah. It's not just this like random flood of sensations coming at us. It's our minds. They're imposing order. They're like
Yeah.
creating meaning out of all that chaos. And Kant, he identifies 12 of these fundamental categories, these tools, and he groups them, you know, into four families. He calls them quantity, and then there's quality, and then relation, and then modality. Those are the four. Four families, 12 categories. Okay. I'm starting to think we need a diagram here. But seriously, like where do we even begin with all this?
Well, let's start with quantity, I think. Quantity is probably the easiest one to wrap your head around, the most intuitive, I guess you could say. So this family, this group of categories, it deals with how we perceive the amount of something, you know? Like just how much there is of it. Think about it. You look around a room, right? You
Yeah.
instantly know, okay, there's one table and there's like several chairs and there are a bunch of books on the shelf over there. That's your mind. It's using those categories, the categories of unity and plurality and totality.
So, okay, unity would be like recognizing that a single object, like a coffee mug, it's a distinct, it's a thing, it's one thing. And then plurality would be like, oh, hey, there are multiple coffee mugs on the table,
Yeah.
not just one.
Exactly, yeah. And
Right.
then totality comes in when you think about like all the coffee mugs in the world, right? Or all the coffee mugs in this particular shop, or even just, all the coffee mugs on this one shelf. It's that concept of a collection of things.
Got it. Okay. So even something is like as basic as counting or just recognizing how many things there are,
Yeah.
it all relies on these categories that Kant's talking about. It's like they're the foundation, like of how we even understand numbers, how we understand quantity.
Exactly. And it's not just about counting, right? It's anytime we're like thinking about how much of something there is or how many parts it has or how it's, divided up.
Okay, cool. So that's quantity. What
Yeah.
about quality? Is that just like good quality versus bad quality?
Not quite, not in Kant's world. For Kant, quality is about the characteristics of things,
Yeah.
the properties that we perceive with our senses. And the categories in this family are reality, and then there's negation, and then there's limitation.
Okay, those sound a little more abstract. Can you give me like a concrete example? What do those categories actually do? Like how do they work?
Sure. So think about how that the coffee mug right there in front of you, it's real, right? It's not just something you're imagining. It's actually there. That's your mind. It's using the category of reality.
So it's what tells us the difference between our actual perceptions, the stuff we're really seeing and hearing,
Yeah.
and like dreams, right? Or hallucinations.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got negation. And negation is about recognizing, what something is not. So that coffee mug, it's not a pencil, it's not a cloud, it's not a rhinoceros. That's negation. It's helping us to differentiate, to see what makes things different from each other.
Ah, okay. So it's like our minds are constantly comparing, they're contrasting, they're figuring out what something is, but they're also figuring out what it isn't.
Exactly, yeah. And then there's limitation. And limitation is about understanding that, things have boundaries. Things are finite, The coffee mug, it has a specific size, right? It has a specific shape. It doesn't just go on forever in all directions.
Okay, yeah, that one makes sense. Limitation is like recognizing that, there are limits to things. Things don't just, go on forever.
Exactly. And these categories of quality, they're really crucial, for how we understand like the entire world around us. They let us perceive the properties of things, to tell things apart and to grasp this concept of limits, of boundaries. They're like the basis of how we make any sense at all of all these, these sensory experiences that we're having all the time.
I'm starting to see this pattern here. It's like all these categories, even though we're not like consciously aware of them, they're like the scaffolding,
Yeah.
the invisible scaffolding that supports our entire understanding of reality.
This is amazing.
What about the next family? What about relation? That sounds pretty juicy.
Relation is where we get into some really fun stuff, because this family of categories, it's all about how we perceive the connections between things, how they interact, how they influence each other. And Kant gives us three categories in this family: inherence and subsistence, and then there's causality and dependence, and then there's community.
Okay, I'm already feeling a little overwhelmed here.
Mhm.
Can you give me like a real world example? How do these relation categories actually like play out?
Uh-huh.
How do they work?
Sure. Let's stick with our coffee mug, our trusty coffee mug here. So you understand that, like that mug, it has certain properties, right? It has a shape, it has a color, it has a weight.
Right.
That's inherence and subsistence. That's what that is. That's what's going on there.
Yeah.
You're recognizing the qualities that make this mug, what it is.
So it's how we understand that things, they have certain characteristics that just belong to them.
Yeah.
That make them what they are.
Yeah, exactly. Then you've got causality and dependence, which is all about cause and effect.
Right.
You know that if you drop that coffee mug, it's going to fall to the floor because of gravity. Or, that if you pour hot coffee into the mug's going to get hot too.
Causality, that's such a fundamental part of like how we understand, anything, right? It's like our minds are always trying to figure out what caused something to happen. It's how we make sense of things and how we, maybe predict what's going to happen next.
Exactly. Without the category of causality, we'd be lost, We wouldn't be able to understand why things happen. We wouldn't be able to make any sense of the world around us. It would just be, just random stuff happening all the time. And then we have community, and community it's a little, maybe a little more abstract, but it's really important too. And this category, it's about recognizing that things, they exist in relation to other things. They influence each other, they interact. The coffee mug, it exists in a community, you could say, with the table it's sitting on, with the person who's using it, with the coffee that's being poured into it. Everything's connected.
So it's like recognizing that things don't just exist in isolation.
Right.
They're always part of like this bigger web, of relationships, of connections.
Exactly, yeah. Community helps us understand that, even things that seem isolated, they're really not. They're part of a system, a bigger system, a network.
Wow. Okay, this is really like mind-blowing, honestly.
Yeah.
It's like Kant has given us this like a whole new way of seeing the world, not just as a bunch of, random objects, but as a system,
Yeah.
a dynamic system of relationships and interactions. It's amazing.
He has. He really has. And we're not even done yet. We still have one more family of categories to explore. Modality.
Oh, okay. Bring it on. I'm ready. I'm ready for more. What is modality all about?
So modality is all about, it's about how we think about the possibility of something, or the existence of it, or the necessity of it. It deals with all the different ways that we can conceive of something being real or not real, or impossible, does it have to exist or could it not exist? Stuff like that.
Okay, I have a feeling this is gonna get pretty deep. What are the actual categories within modality?
Kant gives us three for this one: possibility, impossibility, and then existence, non-existence, and then lastly, there's necessity, contingency.
Whoa, those are some serious mouthful categories.
Yeah.
Can you break those down for me? Like what do they mean?
Sure. So let's start with possibility and possibility.
Yeah.
So think about how you can imagine things, right? Imagine things that don't actually exist, like a unicorn or a city on Mars. That's your mind, that's your mind using the category of possibility. You're recognizing that even though that thing doesn't exist right now, it could, It's conceivable. It doesn't violate the laws of logic or physics or anything.
Yeah. So it's like the difference between what's possible, even if it's not real right now, and what's just completely impossible, like a square circle or, a time-traveling toaster oven.
Exactly. And then you've got existence, non-existence, that one's about recognizing whether something actually exists out there in the world. Right now. So that the coffee mug in front of you,
Wow.
it exists. But you also know that Bigfoot probably doesn't exist.
Right. So existence, non-existence, that's how we ground our thinking in reality.
Yeah.
How we tell the difference between what's actually out there, and what's just a product of our imagination.
Precisely. And then lastly, we have necessity, contingency. And that one's maybe the trickiest one to wrap your head around, the most complex of these categories. And this one is about understanding whether something must exist. Is it a fundamental law of the universe, or does its existence depend on other things, on other factors?
Okay, I'm gonna need an example for that one that I'm not quite following it.
Sure. So think about the law of gravity. Okay, gravity, it's a necessary truth. It operates everywhere the same way throughout the entire universe. But the existence of this specific coffee mug right here in front of us, that's contingent. It depends on somebody having made it and somebody having bought it and somebody having put it on the table. It didn't have to exist. It just, it happens to exist.
Okay, I see. So necessity, contingency, it helps us tell the difference between the universal laws that govern, everything, and then the more specific, random things that happen, the stuff that didn't have to happen, but it did.
Exactly. And with that, We've covered all 12 of Kant's categories of understanding. It's a lot, I know. It's quite a mental workout. But I think it gives us this really amazing, this profound appreciation for how complex our minds actually are, for how they work. And I think that's pretty cool.
It is. I feel like I'm seeing the world in a totally new way, I'm finally starting to understand all the the hidden machinery that makes my experience of reality even possible. It's amazing.
That's the power of Kant. He challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question our assumptions, to really explore those deeper structures that shape how we understand everything.
Well, this deep dive, it's definitely lived up to its name. We've gone deep into Kant's Transcendental Logic, and we've come out I think with a whole new perspective on how our minds actually construct our reality.
It's been a pleasure really exploring these ideas with you, and I hope our listener has enjoyed this journey as much as we have. I think it's fascinating stuff.
I'm sure they have. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Kant's transcendental logic. But this is just the beginning, really. There's so much more to explore, not just in Kant's critique of pure reason, but in the whole world of philosophy. It's out there, waiting for us.
So keep those minds curious, keep asking the big questions. And until next time, happy pondering, everyone.